It all started with the slow, silent erosion of a marriage that once felt unshakable. Alice and Ken had built their life together over years, years filled with laughter, shared dreams, and even the mundane moments that make up a relationship. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, widening like fissures in an earthquake-prone land. It wasn't just the relentless demands of Alice's high-powered job that tore them apart, it was something deeper, more insidious, a growing chasm between two people who no longer recognized each other. Ken often described himself as a ghost haunting his own home, invisible to the woman he loved. He would sit at the dinner table while Alice worked late into the night or scroll through her emails during family outings, feeling like a stranger in the life they had created together. His loneliness festered into resentment, and his frustration simmered until it boiled over. Every unanswered text, every missed anniversary, every excuse about work commitments felt like another nail in the coffin of their marriage. For Ken, the breaking point came when Alice extended yet another business trip without consulting him, canceling their long-planned family vacation. That moment crystallized everything he'd been feeling for months: abandonment, neglect, and betrayal. The man who once adored her now looked at her with cold eyes, his love replaced by anger so raw it burned. As Alice's life unraveled before my eyes, I felt the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on me. She wasn't just my best friend, she was a part of my soul, someone who had been there through every high and low since college. We'd shared dorm rooms, late-night study sessions that turned into deep conversations about life, love, and dreams, and even traveled together before adulthood demanded we grow up. Alice had stood by me when I married my husband, cheering me on as I walked down the aisle, and now she needed me more than ever. But standing beside her came at a cost I wasn't sure I could afford. My husband, though supportive in many ways, drew a hard line when it came to Alice. "She's toxic right now," he said one evening after another heated argument about whether or not I should distance myself from her. His loyalty to Ken was unshakable. They were close friends, bonded over years of fishing trips, home improvement projects, and countless beers shared in Ken's metal shop. To him, Alice wasn't just making poor decisions, she was betraying everything their families once stood for. He accused her of being selfish, reckless, and unfit as both a mother and a friend. And while I understood where he was coming from, his words stung because they echoed doubts I tried so hard to suppress. Every time I defended Alice, my husband grew colder. "You're choosing her over us," he snapped during one particularly tense conversation. The accusation hit like a punch to the gut. Was I? I loved Alice deeply, but I also loved my husband, the man who had built a life with me, who held me when I cried, who promised to stand by me no matter what. How could I possibly choose between two people who meant everything to me? If I stayed loyal to Alice, I risked fracturing the foundation of my marriage. But if I sided with my husband, I would lose a piece of myself, the memories, the laughter, the bond forged over decades. The tension between us became suffocating. Nights that used to be filled with warmth and connection turned into silent battles. My husband stopped asking how I felt about the situation, assuming I'd eventually come around to his way of thinking. Meanwhile, Alice kept reaching out, her voice trembling with desperation. "I need you," she whispered during one phone call, and those 3 words shattered me. I wanted to help her, I truly did, but every step toward her felt like a step away from the life I'd worked so hard to build. Caught in this emotional crossfire, I began to question everything. Had I misjudged Alice's intentions? Was my husband right to push me away from her? Or was I letting fear dictate my choices? Each decision felt like walking a tightrope above a chasm, knowing one wrong move could destroy everything I held dear. The unraveling of Alice's life after the divorce was like watching a car crash in slow motion, devastating, chaotic, and impossible to look away from. What began as emotional turmoil quickly spiraled into reckless behavior that left everyone around her reeling. One fateful Sunday evening, Ken arrived at their old home to drop off their daughter, only to walk into a scene straight out of a nightmare. The house was in shambles, empty bottles littered the floor, clothes strewn about haphazardly, and the air thick with the stench of alcohol. In the backyard, Alice was drunk, barely coherent, and sharing the hot tub with 2 younger men who looked just as bewildered by the situation as Ken did. Their presence wasn't innocent, it was clear they had been drinking heavily together, laughing loudly, and completely oblivious to the world outside their bubble. When Ken opened the door, his face turned pale with shock. His daughter stood beside him, wide-eyed and confused, taking in the chaos before her. Alice, instead of apologizing or attempting to explain herself, lashed out. Her words were slurred but venomous, accusing Ken of being too controlling and insisting it was still Saturday, an absurd claim that only deepened the tension. The 2 men scrambled to gather their things and leave, clearly uncomfortable, while Ken shielded their daughter from the spectacle, ushering her back to his truck without saying a word. But the worst was yet to come. Later that night, fueled by rage and intoxication, Alice sent Ken a barrage of texts so vile they made my stomach churn when I read them later. She called him worthless, accused him of never loving her, and even mocked his masculinity. Each message dripped with hatred, tearing down everything he valued about himself. It wasn't just anger, it was calculated cruelty disguised as drunken rambling. For Ken, this was the final straw. He decided then and there to go nuclear, filing for full custody of their daughter and demanding child support. To him, Alice wasn't just unstable, she was dangerous, both to herself and to their child. As if Alice's life hadn't spiraled out of control enough, she made a decision so reckless it left me breathless with dread. She had reconnected with her daughter's biological father, the very man who had once shattered her spirit and nearly destroyed her life. This wasn't just any toxic ex, this was the monster who had beaten her while she was pregnant, called her vile names like worthless, and kicked her out of his house when she needed him most. He didn't even acknowledge their child as his own, leaving Alice to face the world alone, broken, terrified, and carrying the weight of both physical scars and emotional trauma. I still remember the day I flew to Seattle to pick her up after he abandoned her. She was a shadow of herself, hollow-eyed and trembling, clutching the tiny bundle that was her newborn daughter. That little girl became her lifeline, the reason Alice fought so hard to rebuild her life. And now, years later, Alice was willingly walking back into the arms of the man who had caused her unimaginable pain. When she confessed over the phone, my blood ran cold. "He's changed," she insisted, her voice wavering but defiant. Changed? The same man who slapped her across the face for asking about doctor's appointments? The same man who told her she'd never be anything more than a burden? How could she possibly believe such lies again? My mind raced with horrifying scenarios. What if he hurt her again? What if he tried to manipulate or harm her daughter this time? The thought of that innocent child being exposed to his cruelty made my stomach churn. But Alice was blinded by desperation. She claimed he wanted to meet his daughter, that he deserved a second chance after all these years. Second chances? For someone who had shown no remorse, no effort to make amends? It was maddening. I screamed into the phone, begging her to see reason, but she shut me down, accusing me of not understanding how much she'd forgiven him in her heart. Forgiveness is one thing, but throwing yourself into the path of danger is another entirely. Her stubbornness felt like a betrayal, not just of our friendship, but of everything she had worked so hard to overcome. As she boarded that plane to Seattle, I couldn't shake the image of her stepping straight into a trap, one that might cost her everything she held dear. As Alice packed for her supposed business trip to Dallas, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Among her belongings was a thick winter coat and, most bizarrely, a Seattle Mariners jersey. My heart seemed to stop as the pieces began to fall into place. Why would she need such items for a trip to Dallas, where the weather was still warm? The jersey struck me as particularly odd. Alice had never shown any interest in baseball before. Panic surged through me as I realized this wasn't just careless packing, it was a deliberate attempt to conceal the truth. My mind raced with questions. Was she lying about her destination? And if so, who was she really meeting? I tried to stay calm, but every instinct screamed that something was horribly wrong. When I asked her casually about the jersey, she brushed it off with a vague excuse, claiming it was just something random. Her evasiveness only deepened my unease. Later, when I got home, my husband and I scoured the internet for answers. What we discovered left me breathless with dread. Alice's ex, the toxic man who had abused her years ago, lived in Seattle and was an avid Mariners fan. It all made sense now. She wasn't going to Dallas at all. She was flying straight into the arms of the man who had once shattered her life. The realization hit me like a freight train. How could she be so reckless? After everything he'd done to her, how could she even consider seeing him again? My chest tightened as I thought about the danger she, and her daughter, might be walking into. This wasn't just a bad decision, it was a potential catastrophe waiting to unfold. The phone call between Alice and me turned into a verbal battleground, each word laced with venom and desperation. My voice trembled as I confronted her about the truth of her trip to Seattle. "You're handing a knife to the man who once stabbed you," I hissed, my tone sharp enough to cut glass. The metaphor wasn't exaggerated, it was visceral, raw, and painfully accurate. This wasn't just about reconnecting with an old flame, this was about willingly stepping back into the arms of someone who had abused her, degraded her, and left her broken. But Alice, stubborn as ever, refused to see reason. Her voice carried a chilling calmness, as if she were reciting lines from a script she didn't fully understand. "That was years ago," she said dismissively, brushing off the weight of her past like it was dust on her sleeve. "People change, and I have the right to make my own decisions." Her words hit me like a slap across the face. How could she be so blind? How could she forget the night she cried herself to sleep after he called her worthless? How could she ignore the scars, both visible and invisible, that he had left on her soul? My frustration boiled over into rage. Do you even hear yourself? I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of emotion. He's toxic. He's dangerous. And you're dragging your daughter into this mess too. I could feel my chest tightening, my breaths coming in shallow gasps as the enormity of what she was doing sank in. She wasn't just risking her own safety, she was jeopardizing everything she had worked so hard to rebuild, including her relationship with her child. But Alice wouldn't budge. I'm not asking for your permission, she snapped, her voice cold and final. That was the moment something inside me shattered. I couldn't save her, not from him, not from herself. In that instant, I made the hardest decision of my life. If you get on that plane, I said, my voice trembling but resolute, don't ever contact me again. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For a fleeting second, I thought she might reconsider, might apologize or promise to think things through. But then she replied, her tone defiant, fine. One word, sharp and unyielding, sealed our fate. After I blocked Alice's number, the weight of what had just happened crashed over me like a tidal wave. I sat on the couch, tears streaming down my face, unable to breathe as if an invisible hand was squeezing the life out of my chest. It wasn't just that I'd lost my best friend, it felt like I'd lost a piece of myself, a part of my soul that could never be replaced. Alice and I had shared so much, late-night conversations in our dorm room, laughter-filled road trips, and even the darkest moments when we leaned on each other for survival. Those memories weren't just hers, they were mine too. And now, it felt like she was erasing them with every reckless decision she made. The silence between my husband and me that night was deafening. He didn't say much, just held me as I cried, his arms around me feeling both comforting and futile. I'm sorry, he whispered at one point, his voice heavy with empathy. But no amount of apologies or understanding could fill the void Alice left behind. She wasn't just my friend, she was my history, my anchor through years of growth and change. Losing her felt like losing a chapter of my life I couldn't rewrite. What hurt the most was knowing there was nothing more I could do. I had tried everything, pleading, reasoning, warning, but none of it mattered. In the end, Alice chose her path, and it led straight into danger. The realization that I couldn't save her from herself was suffocating. My husband and I exchanged glances, unspoken words hanging in the air. We both understood, sometimes, love isn't enough. No matter how deeply you care for someone, you can't force them to make the right choices. That night, as I stared into the darkness, I mourned not only the loss of Alice but also the shattered illusion that I could protect everyone I loved. The day Alice boarded that flight to Seattle, my heart sank like a stone into an abyss of dread. Despite every warning, every desperate attempt to pull her back from the edge, she chose to walk straight into what I feared would become her worst nightmare. Her decision wasn't just reckless, it was self-destructive, a betrayal not only of herself but also of the trust and love we had shared for decades. As the plane lifted off the ground, I couldn't shake the image of her stepping into a storm she wasn't prepared to face. That man, the one who had once broken her spirit, left bruises on her skin, and shattered her sense of worth, was waiting for her. And this time, he might take more than just her dignity, he could harm her daughter too, an innocent child caught in the crossfire of her mother's poor choices. I spent hours staring at my phone, hoping against hope that she'd call or text, saying she'd changed her mind. But nothing came. The silence was deafening, each passing minute stretching into eternity as fear tightened its grip around me. What if history repeated itself? What if the cycle of abuse began anew, this time with an audience, a little girl watching her mother crumble under the weight of bad decisions? My stomach churned at the thought of Alice reliving the horrors of her past, only now with even higher stakes. She wasn't just risking her own life, she was gambling with her daughter's future. This story ends not with resolution but with a haunting reminder: don't let ambition blind you to the people who matter most. Don't let pain drive you toward destruction. Alice's journey serves as a cautionary tale about balance, between work and family, between personal dreams and relational responsibilities. In chasing success, she lost sight of what truly mattered: love, connection, and stability. Now, all I can do is hope that somehow, she finds her way back before it's too late, for her sake, and for her daughter's.